Welcome to the West Side Podcast. Each week, we'll take a relevant topic under the microscope to see what the Bible has to say about it. You will gain tools and information you need to support your faith walk and build Christ-centered families in Kansas City and beyond. I'm your host, Troy Kennedy. Okay, friends, fair warning. We're into some bumpy waters here today. My name is Troy Kennedy, and this is the West Side Podcast. We're going to be doing some interesting exploration of some ideas here today, some things that you may not have really heard put a name on before, but some things you definitely experienced as you go about your life and culture and you observe things that are happening in the media and in the world all around us. So we're tackling a topic today called critical theory. If you're not familiar with the term, chances are you know its fruits. So according to Britannica.com, this is a Marxist-inspired movement in social and political philosophy that's been influencing all kinds of areas of study for decades. And what we're seeing and experiencing in our world today is kind of what this movement has produced. So Pastor Randy Frazee joins me here today. And as we begin our series, What Does Jesus Have to Say?
Yeah.
And I'm sure glad that I'm not here by myself.
Yeah, the feeling is mutual. Yeah, and I just want to remind everyone that pops in, whether you're at Westside or anywhere around the world for that matter, that we are hopefully two people that you trust not to misguide you. Yeah. We're not necessarily the brightest bulbs in the chandelier, but we're someone you can trust. But we do really love, Troy and I could spend hours talking about this kind of stuff, right. And we're trying to take it and make it accessible to you, and things that maybe would not work really well on a Sunday morning, right. But we want to speak into these issues with a biblical, Jesus-focused thing. So we don't have, there's lots of people who write and speak about topics like this, but we're really trying to bring some understanding to it from a biblical Jesus point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. And to also just to give you some handles on, to know it when you see it, to understand what the implications are of it, and it might give you a little bit of an explanation as to why things happen in culture that seem really irrational at times. They may seem really incoherent, but there really is a worldview and an internal coherence in that worldview that explains a lot of the behavior that you're observing. So one, we want to come at this from a humble standpoint and a loving standpoint. We don't have all the answers, and this is some really extraordinarily complex stuff that we're going to try and put some simple handles on for you. But more than anything, we want you to know that this isn't some kind of partisan political statement at all. What we are committed to the kingdom of God, and we're trying to bring some light to situations that you as a Christ follower are definitely navigating in the world today. And so that is our heart. And if you find this to feel like it's, pushing against your political buttons, that's not our intention at all. It's just to lovingly try and bring some clarity to the situation.
Yeah, because I think if you're, one of the things you're going to find is that particularly the year 2020 is that you feel like you're in a country and you're like, but I could never feel more distant with a group of people. I'm watching, and again, whatever side you're on, you're watching this activity and go like, I do not know why these people are doing what they're doing. Right. All right. Now, so you watch that, right? With all the things we've experienced, this critical theory is at the very root of it. It doesn't sound like it would be the answer to it, but it's going to explain why maybe people in your family, extended family, or your neighborhood, or people you see on TV are acting the way they're acting differently than the way you are. Well, they're coming from a different worldview, right? And that's what this critical theory is. So,
it's not just something that's off in a corner of some little esoteric part of academia. This is something that's been brewing for a really long time. So I just want to give you just a real quick thumbnail of like the history of this, where it came from, and kind of how we're seeing it manifest a little bit here today. So, and forgive me for being such a nerd, but historically, so you guys are probably familiar with who Karl Marx is, and he had a philosophy called Marxism, and Marxism basically says this: that people can be divided into a couple of groups. You have oppressors and oppressed. And for Marx, it was primarily about economics. It was about people who had stuff and people who didn't have stuff. And it was really the driver behind the forming of the Soviet Union, the driver behind Mao's China, the driver behind Pol Pot and Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, and basically any sort of overly socialized communist kind of Cuba and North Korea. These are the kinds of places that have embraced this philosophy. Well, what happened was we all know that the Soviet Union kind of came apart, and by the time we got into the 1960s, this hard kind of Marxism and communism especially became pretty much almost defunct. In other words, they realized it wasn't sustainable. It was pretty bankrupt in terms of a way of producing and sustaining a population, and all the things that it claimed to bring equality to, it really didn't do. And even in France, where a lot of the postmodern philosophers like Derrida and Foucault and Sartre, they were all recognizing this. So what happened was, with that kind of falling out of favor, they kind of made a flip, and they took that same oppressor-oppressed narrative, and now they applied it to people groups, identity groups. So you have people of color versus white people. You talk about male and female. You could have it have to do with trans people or straight people, all these different things. And we can talk about that in a little bit. But the idea was, it took it from an economic platform to more of almost a racially or identity group platform. So it becomes identity politics. You may have heard that term before. And it's really based on, there is an oppressor group, which might be the white, straight, cisgendered Christian male, right, who is like kind of the top of the oppressor group. And then the bottom would be people of color who are women, people of color who are trans women, people of color who are trans Muslim women, and it kind of goes on and on like that. So there's a hierarchy. And if I could just kind of like put a couple of quick handles on this, and then we can get into some details.
Yeah, I'm going to pull out some examples that we had talked about ahead of time.
Right.
But go ahead, keep going.
Yeah, so one, what it does is it reduces all relationships to power. So you just get that in your mind. It's all about power. Who has the power and who doesn't have the power? So it's the oppressor versus the oppressed. In this case, it could be white people versus people of color. Okay, so if you keep that, it's like that is kind of like the top of the way we understand it. And then secondly, it reduces all people to their skin color. So or identity group. So your skin, if you're a white man, well, that's the primary thing to know about you. And knowing that about you tells me everything I need to know about you.
Yeah.
Okay. So it tells me the way you think. It tells me the way you feel. It tells me what your motives are. It tells me what your character is. It tells me your culpability.
Even without having a conversation with me.
Don't have to have a conversation with you. I just have to look at you and go, okay, well, he's a racist. He's this, he's that, and he's that. And he's culpable even for historic issues that have been perpetrated on people who have oppressed my identity group. And then my identity group, we all have to think the same way. We all have to feel the same way. We have to ascribe to the same ideas. So if that is the simplest way of putting it, it reduces every relationship to power, and it reduces every relationship to an identity group. That is the main thing to know about you.
So let's give an example. It's easier to let's ask some examples. So like in Marxism, which was the goal was equal outcome, right?
Equal outcome of economy.
Economy. So like everybody, no matter, it was an economic thing. So everybody ended up with the same amount at the end of the day, which didn't work.
Really
poorly. Matter of fact, it didn't work. Matter of fact, you gave a couple of examples of that in history of what they tried to do to make it work and manufacture it, and to make it work, and it just didn't.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the Soviet Union is probably the best example of it. But in trying to engineer this, what they did is the people who don't have stuff, the reason they don't have the money or the house or the land or whatever it is because the oppressor, the class, which in this the bourgeoisie, right? They stole it from you. And so you rally and catalyze and energize people to say, hey, yeah, that's right. It's not because of me, it's because of you. And so they got a lot of energy around that. And what happened was, if you continue to take that line of thought and you have to eradicate the oppressor, in the Soviet Union, it was a really murderous, bloody outcome. And so, like, for instance, in the Ukraine, 6 million people starved because they wiped out all the farmers, the competent, good farmers, the ones who had the land, who had the systems and everything. They killed off the good doctors. So when Stalin was dying, they didn't have good doctors to help him out at the end of his life. And it sounds like a joke, but it actually happened that way. And so you take that same mentality and apply it to identity, right? And these people groups that are at odds with one another. And you can see it could devolve into something very dangerous very quickly.
So, again, we're trying to stay away from politics, but let's take a 2020 example today. So if everyone listening knows, we're just going to try to take an example of this that could get us a little bit into trouble, but we're trying to it'll explain what you're seeing on television, because we're going to come back in a moment and talk about there's some good things about this that God is for. So we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but just to get an example of something, maybe on the television, maybe defund police or something like that. Can you go with something like that?
So if the idea here is, one, you don't really have an individual voice. You're just a mouthpiece for your identity group. And if the greatest thing you're attempting to do through critical theory the most moral thing you can do is to overthrow the oppressor. In other words, they say you have to make oppression visible. You have to call it out. You have to cancel it. You have to overthrow it. And so you identify the oppressor, and then the objective is to overthrow the oppression. So something like defund the police starts to make a lot of sense. You're like, yeah, well, they're the oppressor, and so they have to be eradicated.
Yeah, not let's not have a conversation.
Right.
It's just like eliminate, so now that the power has completely flip-flopped, right? Or they're trying to equalize it out, right? But they're ones in power to equalize it out, which becomes it's
a new hierarchy that you say you're trying to avoid. So I would just say this. Another piece of this is, we all agree to Dr. Martin Luther King's dream that one day we dream of a day when my children would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Mm-hmm. And this is absolutely antithetical to that.
Explain that, because I thought we talked about that. I think that's brilliant because we do embrace so much of the ideology of how Martin Luther King Jr. approached this real topic of racism within our communities. I mean, it's real, and we embrace it, and Jesus embraces it for sure, and we got to do something about it. But the way in which he approached it is philosophically, worldview-wise, a flip-flop. So you said it. It sounds pretty obvious, but make sure everyone hears.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. King was a Christian pastor, and he believed that people were made in the image of God, and their value is because of what God said about them, not about what other people said about them. And so if his children are going to be judged, it's not because they're black, because looking at the color of my skin doesn't say anything about my character, doesn't say anything about what I really think or what I believe or what I'm guilty for or what what I've earned for myself. All it is my color. Yeah. And that was what he wanted to say about people. But this actually flips that completely over and it just says, no, everything I need to know about you is associated with your identity group. It tells me everything I need to know. So there's no desire for mutual understanding. There's no civil discourse, even freedom of speech is not a value. Yeah. It's all about, okay, well, I know everything I need to know about you, so I just need to shut you up.
Yeah. So there's going to be, this is when I listen to podcasts, I'm usually running. And when I've come across an example like this with Martin Luther King, it's a paradigm shift for me, because I would think that critical theory people would go like, oh, Martin Luther King Jr. is our father of our movement. It is completely the opposite. And I'm like, okay, that is a disruptive idea. Right. I stop in my run and I rewind back to that and let me listen to that again. So we just had one of those moments where you're going to, what Troy's talking about here, because it is really disruptive, because you think it's one side's all this way, one side's all this way. Mm-hmm. This is a very important thing if you're really trying to understand what's going on in our world today. This example is really, really important, isn't it?
Absolutely. And just to understand one thing too, because some of you, we've all come up through universities, and this thing has been bubbling up since the 80s in elite levels of academia, and we'd like to think it was just some esoteric thing, but it's really not. And it has been taught to university students for so long now that it's, for a lot of people, it's almost like this is the water we're swimming in. Yeah. This is just how things are. This is how I was taught. My parents spent $200,000 for me to go to this university to listen to these guys who are smarter than I am to tell me how I should think in the world. And so I did. Yeah. And this is what they taught me. Yeah. And so, but I also understand this, that not everybody who, people have varying degrees of understanding and varying degrees of buy-in on these things. So if you work in the HR department at your employment, and you're trying to include diversity, inclusion, and equity training with your employees, because all that sounds really great. And it sounds like, yeah, this is the right thing to do. But the nomenclature doesn't always reveal the underpinning values that are really coming through in this. And you may not understand that, or you may have some degree of understanding of it. So we just want to say, you know what? If the shoe don't fit, don't put it on.
Yeah.
But if it does fit, and you have observed this in relationships that you have, then we want to help give you some tools and some handles and just a Christ-like perspective on how to navigate that situation.
Yeah, that's going to be real helpful in the workplace now, particularly. But you know, I think again another idea here is that Martin Luther King Jr.'s outcome was let's move away from all of these things that separate us, and this would be the ultimate vision of Christ. We're not going to try to in Revelation 5:9. We're going to change the color of your skin. Right. You know, that's not it. But the idea is that your value and your worth has nothing to do with that. It has to do with your association with Jesus and the content of your character and those kinds of things. Well, that is a really good ideal. But when you flip flop it and say no, it is the color of your skin that matters.
Right.
Well, then then a white supremacist could say you're absolutely right. It is the color of your skin, and we think ours is the right one. And and then when it's happening, you try to take you could probably list 10 different groups from white and black and brown, and then women, and then your gender and all the
gender,
the
preferences,
sexuality kind of things. So let's get 10, and the goal is not to judge us by the content of our character, but that we're all equal. And that and that at the end of the day, if there's any sense of oppression in that, then you got to overcome it. So what ends up happening is you silence society, and you probably have felt that way. You're probably like, I don't even know what I can say anymore, and which is what happens, right? Because you become the oppressor. Would that be fair?
Absolutely. The objective is just to basically to cow people who disagree.
And that's the cancel culture. That's what cancel culture is. It's like, if you're going to do that, then you're done. We're going to ring a bell when you talk, right?
And there's really the interesting thing about it is. And the sad thing about it is it's very puritanical. It's almost like a fundamentalist kind of a religion, because you have to agree to every tenet of the worldview, and if you don't, right, you're cast out, you're ostracized, you're kicked out of the church. So if you want to say it like that, because you didn't sign on to all of the dogmas that we agree to. The problem is it's kind of a moving target. There's a lot of the language there's a lot of linguistic gymnastics that have been happening. When Amy Coney Barrett was in front of Congress, and she said something about people's sexual preferences, and the internet went ballistic, because apparently 15 minutes ago, sexual preference was not an okay term to use. And in the same day, Webster's dictionary went and changed the definition of sexual preference, because you're supposed to say sexual orientation now.
Oh,
yeah. So it's a really.
I'll write that down.
Yeah, you got it. It's a moving target, and so a lot of the words that you hear, and which we'll get to in a bit, things like inclusion, which it's a great word, right? Diversity sounds like a great word. Racism, right? Which we think we might have one understanding of, but people who ascribe to this worldview have a different definition for that word, or anti-racism for that matter. So what I'd like to do, if it's okay, I want to run through some of the tenets of this, just to kind of give a few simple bullet points for people, and then maybe we can unpack some of that as we go.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to just make one more comment. The changing of the definition. The question is, who is the authority board that gets to decide that? And this is a part of the point, is right. Who's the one who decides that that phrase is no longer appropriate? Right. And that's where the power thing comes in, right? Someone's controlling this conversation and says, you're not supposed to say that anymore. Right. Someone's controlling that, right?
And generally, it's no centralized source here, but there's sort of this if the person I don't like is saying that thing, we flip the language on it to vilify it. Yeah. Right. To turn it into something negative, because we can't agree with anything that person says. So, there's a lot of gymnastics, a lot of hoop jumping in a lot of this. And once again, it's, we're trying to put simpler handles on it, but there's been a lot of very academic work done on this that in the show notes, we'll give you some resources that if you want to dive deeper, you can go and check out some of these sources that will be able to explain it better than we will here in this hour or so on this conversation. So
you're going to do tenets right now, and then we'll do a little biblical stuff too, because there's some of this that the Bible has a lot to say about this. Absolutely. And then we'll maybe go back and forth on that a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
For sure.
Drop in these tenets.
So there's just a few things here. One, tenets of critical theory. Get your pencils out. One, critical theory emphasizes group identity over individualism. individual identity is inseparable from your group identity as oppressed or oppressors. We talked about that a bit. So to say that your individualism is an illusion, you are a mouthpiece for your group identity, and that's why there's no need for conversation or dialogue, right? The objective isn't to win the argument, it's to overpower the argument. Does that make sense? And so you probably see that in a conservative speaker at a university, and people come with bullhorns and noisemakers and everything.
When he says something that is something they would consider coming from the lips of an oppressor.
Even before he says a word.
Yeah, because it doesn't matter what he says, right?
They've already prejudged the guy. It doesn't matter what he's going to say. It's that we need to shut him up before he spews his poison. So
and it's not even just all white. It could be a black man who's oppressing women, which right? It could be something like that as well.
Or anyone who disagrees. So, for instance. If you're a white person, you say something that they disagree with, we just say, well, you're just trying to sustain your social location by using the tools of your supremacy, right? If you say you're a black person and you agree to that, well, you've internalized your oppression.
Right.
Yeah,
so
that's
good.
You can't really win there. Or if you're someone like Candace Owens, who is a black woman, who is a very articulate, powerfully spoken black woman, she's been called a white supremacist. You get someone like Ben Shapiro, who is an Orthodox Jew, yarmulke wearing everyday Jew. He's been called a Nazi. Right. So you kind of go, I don't know how that works, but
the conversation doesn't matter, right?
It doesn't matter.
It's because he is that person, skin color, man, Jew, whatever, not even Jew, but he could be called a Nazi even though he's a Jew.
Right.
And that's ridiculous, right?
Yeah, and even if you have the skin color, but you disagree with us,
right?
You not only have you betrayed your race, right? You've internalized your oppression. And so you can get someone like, for instance, I hate to say it, but like a presidential candidate saying, well, if you don't vote for me, you're not black. Because you're not thinking like a black person, because this is how black people think.
Right.
So that's part of it. So, and then the second tenet here is this: critical theory defines oppression as the exercise of hegemonic power. In other words, the ability of a group to impose its values, its norms, and expectations on society. Oppressor groups subjugate oppressed groups through the exercise of hegemonic power. So hegemonic power would be something like say like magazines. There's an aesthetic that is perpetuated for how women are supposed to look. So without ever really saying it, they're exercising a kind of hegemonic power to say, we're defining how women are supposed to look just by virtue of our position. Or, let's see, we're talking about, what would be another way of doing that? Or Hollywood, we talk about, like, say, sexual mores. So TV shows and movies. And so normalizing some things that 10 years ago would have been totally anathema. Nobody would have even thought that these things could be put up. Now they're on network TV. And they're normalizing these things. And that's an exercising of hegemonic power to tell society, this is what is real. This is what our people are.
So like an example from TV, because I think a lot of us live in that space, thanks to Netflix and all that. But so like a show, like if you remember the show, the series Mad Men, that sort of portrayed the men a certain way and the women a certain way, I think back in the 50s, and that would have been considered oppression and all that. Now today, this many years later, in terms of time frame, you can see something in terms of relationships and things that they're doing on television that are like, wow, I can't even believe this. And the reason is they're trying to create a sense of equality.
Or they're just trying to introduce a different narrative. They're influencing it, and it's probably not even as conscious as that. But the bigger idea is they would say that, look, the oppressor, which would be the white, straight, cisgendered, male, older male, right? They have been exercising hegemonic power through all of these different tools of oppression that have been so normalized over so much time that people don't even realize that's what's happened. Right. So
they're trying to dismantle that.
And what they're trying to say is they're trying to call it out and dismantle it and say, okay, you're just solidifying your social location by the use of these tools. It's very interesting. The Smithsonian Institution had put out an infographic that was part of one of their museums, and it's it talks about whiteness. So you'll hear this word a lot of the time. Whiteness is not just the color of your skin, but sort of this hegemonic power, this culture that's been created by white people as oppressors to sustain their social location. So they put out this infographic and they describe these are things that are typical of whiteness. This is what it is to exercise this power over the people by these values. Things like individualism. You say that that's rugged individualism is something that is used to subjugate other people or to invalidate other ways of being. The nuclear family as the ideal social unit is one of those things. It's one of those white ways of ruling over people. Emphasis on scientific method. So the scientific method is a tool of oppression, objective, rational, linear thinking, quantitative emphasis, things like that. Something like hard work is the key to success, right? So that value would be considered a white oppressor value. Christianity as a norm would be considered an oppressive value.
Meaning, if I don't buy into Christian, then I'm going to have less access to. I've got to buy into that in order to have access to power. Is that right?
Or it's something that's been used to subjugate people. And I mean, the thing is, in all of these things we're talking about, there's a seed of truth.
Truth there is, yeah, that's right.
And and we need to acknowledge that some of these things, people have used Christianity historically for ways that were absolutely antithetical to anything Jesus was about. The guy who's trying to convert a Muslim at sword point clearly misses Jesus, who said, hey, Peter, put your sword away.
Yeah.
That's not what I'm about. Hey, my kingdom is not of this world. Oh, by the way, the greatest among you will be the servant of all, right? So someone didn't send that memo out during the Crusades.
And I think this is a big challenge that we have, Troy, is that the church has absolutely through the centuries has not been a great model of the teachings of the scriptures, all of the scriptures, but particularly the teachings of Jesus. And people have gotten a bit sideways with throwing Christianity, a movement where Jesus comes on the scene and he is for the oppressed person.
Yeah.
I mean, Matthew 25, and we'll talk about scriptures in a minute. He's for it. It's like, how did we get here where the leader of our entire movement was for this idea from a totally different base, and yet now it's been flipped. But part of that we have to own ourselves.
Absolutely, and history tells us that people can take any kind of worldview and make it violent and make it oppressive and twist it to serve themselves, which is exactly what Jesus was against when he laid into the Pharisees and the legalists of his own time. Is to say, you strain out an gnat, you swallow a camel, right? You're laying these burdens on people. Why? To sustain your position.
Yeah.
And Jesus was absolutely against that. And we need to own our participation in those things. But I don't need to own that guy's participation in it.
That's exactly right.
Or that guy 100 years ago, whatever his participation was in it. Because I'm not defined by my skin color's association with that thing.
Yeah, and my challenge has been over the years as a pastor is that Christians need to be more sophisticated in their thinking. It's not so simplistic like, critical theory is all wrong.
Right.
There's elements to it that are very much rooted in the teachings of Jesus in the Bible. We're going to talk about a few of those in a minute.
Right.
So just be much more, and don't become a cancel culture on
yourself.
Before
we're finished.
Yeah, we stopped listening to the Randy and Troy because they even gave credence to some of the ideas.
Right. Because and that hopefully that's why we kind of pause here to say that, because there's always a seed of truth to these things, but that's what the enemy does. He takes a seed of truth and then he covers it over with just a miasma of lies to create more division and more destruction and more hostility, where Jesus was the Prince of Peace.
Right.
So our hope here is that we can kind of take some insight into these things and how do we be an instrument of peace in the middle of a culture that is adopting so much of this.
Yes.
So for instance, assigning things like future planning as tools of whiteness, delayed gratification, being on time, rigid time schedules, those kinds of things have been attributed to whiteness, English common law. So we can go on and on. There's a ton of these things, but all that to say that it does a real disservice to people to say that, okay, well, delayed gratification is just a white thing, so I'm going to go ahead and fulfill every impulse that I have.
You need to be okay with that.
And you need to be, because to tell me I can't is an oppressive statement.
Yeah, that's right.
As opposed to someone who loves you and is trying to help you,
Right.
keep you out of the ditch.
That worldview makes parenting very hard.
It's
right?
real rough to tell a 5-year-old to just go ahead and follow all your
Right,
impulses.
right.
Delayed gratification is way overstated. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, obviously, critical theory would have to have some sort of response to that. It's like,
I'm
you
sure
know,
that, yeah.
You know, absolutely. So let's do a couple of scripture passages. I wrote down one, and maybe you can throw one out.
Mm-hmm.
You know, mine's Psalm 82, and this is like what is really good about critical theory in terms of the issue of oppression. The Bible,
Right.
I mean, has a lot to say about it. You know, so I'll just read one from
Yeah.
the Old Testament, Psalm 82. It says, God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods, and the gods would have been the oppressors. It would have been the rulers,
Right.
the kings, the judges of that day. So think
Right.
of the people that have the authority there. So God's now saying, okay, I'm now in the seat, and you are being judged.
Right.
And it says, how long will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked?
Right.
Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. The gods know nothing. They understand nothing. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I say, you are gods. You are all sons of the Most High, but you will die like mere mortals. You will fall like every other ruler. Rise up, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations are your inheritance.
Right.
And I would think someone from the critical theory go like, yeah, but now
Right.
this is a deal where God is the ultimate one in charge.
Right.
And he's the one who's got all of the power. He is all powerful, and he's saying he's against oppression.
Right.
But I don't know in the critical theory if it. I know in like I would assume that that religion is considered an oppression. So the idea of God as the ultimate authority
Right.
is in giving that to a God versus themselves is not something that is really that helpful.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that's really important to understand, that when critical theory says you have to overthrow the hegemonic power. What it's saying is it wants to replace that hegemonic power with its own. And the thing is the Bible is one hegemonic discourse from top to bottom to tell you everything about reality, everything about ethics, everything about how you are to live. And so the critical theorist would say, well, I don't want to submit to that one. I have my own. And they are not congruent. They are in conflict with one another, and you can't hold one and the other in two different hands, right? So that's a really important thing to understand, even though the scripture clearly talks about coming against oppression, to stand up for the widow and for the fatherless and for the orphan and to the person who is in prison and person who is
In Matthew
hungry.
25.
Matthew 25. Yeah, it's like, well, Jesus clearly is advocating for people to step into that, but it's not because we're trying to overturn the tables of power. It's because we're called to serve out of love for our Creator.
Yeah. This is a really big deal, because Jesus had harsh language for the person who did not
Right.
lend a hand, to that deal. He said in Luke 14, when you're inviting someone to dinner,
Right.
Don't just invite the people, who are wealthy, the people who are your family and friends and relatives, because and that who can return a favor to you, but invite the person who is crippled and poor among you. And he said they won't be able to do anything for you, but I will see that, and
Right.
and I will reward you in the kingdom to come. So there's just and again, we're not defending our whiteness as too.
Right.
I mean, we fit we have all the categories of the.
We're at the height of the oppressor.
Yeah. And it
hierarchy.
creates
Yeah.
a little bit of discredits a little bit for some that might be listening, going like, we've already discredited you. They probably tuned off a long time ago
Right.
because they simply looked at the fact that we were old white men,
Right.
or you're at least old, and said, we shut it off because there's no way, we don't have to listen to their thoughts. But the reality is our allegiance is to Jesus, right?
Yeah. Right.
And our identity is found in Jesus, and He's calling us to something completely different that Martin Luther King Jr. really captured.
Well, absolutely. And the thing is so we talk about when we started this off, we had these two fundamental ways of understanding. One is that it's all about power, right? Fundamentally is about power, oppressor and oppressed. And and those oppressor and oppressed categories have to do with your identity groups. Well, as a Christ follower, Jesus shows us to love because he first loved us, right? He called us to serve. He says, actually, he said to love your enemies and love those, bless those who persecute you, bless those who are problem. If you love people who just already are like you, well, you're not doing anything better than people who aren't Christ followers, right? So the whole point of that, Jesus is saying, look, it's not about power, it's about service. In Matthew 20, Jesus says, the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. He's talking to his disciples after one of them, their mother, came to Jesus and said, hey, by the way, can my son sit on either side of you in your kingdom? He says, it's not mine to give away. And by the way, it's not about us exercising our power over people. That is not the economy of the kingdom of God. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. And just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. That's the message of Jesus in dealing with this dynamic, this oppressor-oppressed kind of a dynamic.
That's really good.
And then secondly, it says, we said it reduces all people to their skin color or their identity group as being the most paramount thing to know about an individual. It tells you everything you need to know just by saying, okay, well, this is, say you're a white, gay, Muslim, trans guy. Okay, so now I know how you think. I know how you vote. I know how you operate in the world.
No, let me talk, though. Let me tell you what I think. No.
No. And if you do disagree with it, then you've internalized your oppression.
I need to go see a counselor and get back to my identity group.
Right, or just shut up.
Yeah, or just shut up. But if you don't shut up, we will shut you up.
Well, and ring our bell and or get you defunded or get you fired. Right, or you physically hurt you.
Yeah.
But our response is, as Christ says this, Jesus tells you that your primary identity is you are made in the image of God, that you are of infinite value, and you are unconditionally loved by your Creator. In Galatians chapter 3, so Paul writes this, he says, so in Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith. For all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is neither Jew, nor Gentile, nor slave, nor free, nor male or female, for you are all one in Christ. See, the most important thing, the most paramount thing to know about you is that you are loved by your Creator and that you are made in the image of God. And that informs every other layer of identity that you have.
And that is available to who?
To
everyone.
To everyone.
Yeah, that kind of identity is not discriminated against in any of those. You mentioned any of those categories.
Right.
That all of them have equal. All of us have equal access to this new identity, and I think that's where in Ephesians it says that there was this tension between the Jews and the Gentiles, and we think there's tensions between blacks and whites today, Jews and Gentiles. Oh my gosh! I mean, it's still going on to this day.
Samaritans.
Samaritans. I mean, it's still going to this day. If you haven't studied Israel's the geographical land of Israel, and basically says, no, I'm going to tear the wall down. I'm going to tear the wall down between the Jew and the Gentile, and I'm going to build up a new humanity, a whole new humanity. What do you think about that? Is that a new humanity? It's like something brand new that's not based upon being a Jew or a Gentile or the Galatians passage which you read earlier.
Right.
It's about slave or free, Jew or Gentile, male or female. It's like those categories. So it's a different. It's addressing the subject of oppression, but it's doing it from a totally different way.
And I think it has everything to do with identity.
Yeah, it does.
So when these identity groups are they're so paramount, but as a Christ follower, we say, your identity is paramount. And your identity is what God has said about you. It's not about what skin color you have or what your sexuality is or what your politics are or whatever it is. It's what God has said about you that defines you and is the most important thing, most primary thing to know about you. And as soon as you have that centered and that rooted, it's not even about, you can lose all the identity politics and still find your identity in your job.
Yeah.
Or you can find your identity on how good of a parent you are. It's just another kind of legalism.
Yeah.
It's another kind of performanceism. And God is saying, you can release all of that.
Get rid of all
because
of it.
all of another thing, critical theorists, and this whole project is completely graceless.
Yeah.
You screw up, you're out. You're done. You're canceled. Right?
Canceled, yeah.
Right? Was it Ken Hart told a joke on Twitter 15 years ago that could be construed as like, and it was a joke, right? Because comedians make jokes that push buttons. But it was a joke about homosexuality. And 15 years later, it's like, you can't host the Oscars because of this thing you said
15 years ago.
15
years ago, they didn't say anything about it. And they might have should have. He may not have should have made that joke, right? But he got canceled. And there's no forgiveness.
There's no you're irredeemable.
Yeah.
Right? But for the Christ followers, it's our identity is in what Jesus has said about us, and our identity is what he has done for us. Then there is grace, and there is forgiveness,
yes,
and there is redemption, and no sin that you're committing is beyond forgiveness, beyond redemption, beyond reconciliation with God.
Yeah, and 1 John 1:9, he is going to be faithful and just to continue to forgive you of your sins, not just once and for all, but like today, if you messed up, he doesn't go, you're out, you're canceled, you're done. He says, no, I'm going to forgive you afresh again. Right. And that's the beauty of a works-based, performance-based program and a grace-based one, where our leader, as king, instead of the people going out and dying for him, he died for them. Right. It's a totally different concept altogether.
Right. So as Christ followers, how do we navigate this culture?
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much more to it that we could get into. We don't really have time to do. But the point of this is, how do we honor Jesus as we interact with people who, one, think they know everything about you, and two, probably don't like you, or may not like you for those reasons. And how do you approach that in a way that is full of grace and truth, that is driven by love and doesn't adopt the tools of the enemy, doesn't adopt the tools of a new kind of oppression? What do you think Jesus has to say about that?
Yeah, I wrote down a couple of things. Wow, this is so pretty. Some of them are really simple, and you had made reference to this particular passage out of Romans, which gives us a wonderful list. So if you're not driving or on a run or whatever, make a mental note. It'll be in the notes as well. But Romans 12, 9 through 21. I mean, it's one of my favorite passages of Scripture, which tells us how we respond to people. So we go back to Jesus, not only just to love your neighbor, but he went another step further and said, love your enemy as yourself. Love your enemy as yourself. And then you can read this list, but I'm going to read the verse 21. Do not overcome evil by evil, overcome evil with good. So when someone's trying to cancel you out, don't try to cancel them out as a response, but basically go down deep and seek a way to love them. Instead of canceling them out, identify them and refuse to play by the same playbook. And that's what's in our sinful nature, even as followers of Jesus. It's like, I cannot believe you're doing this. Well, now hopefully you have a better understanding as why they feel so strongly about it. They're trying to overcome oppression, which we're for too. But the ways in which they're going about it lead to very, very dark places. And so the way the way we respond to the people that you encounter is to love your enemy and don't overcome evil by evil. That would be one thing.
And I mean, just understand that the tools of the kingdom are different than the tools of the enemy. So where the culture wants to create more division, create more hostility, create more conflict, create more, reduce you to the simplest possible terms to make a caricature out of you, so I don't have to think about you as a person. Right? So that's what we do. It dehumanizes you to say, well, you're just that. Right? When everyone is a complex miasma of all these different details and all these different contradictions, and the beauty of it is to be human, made in the image of God, redeemable and loved by God. So the tools that we come at these conflicts with are love and joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, and humility. That's our posture as a Christ follower. It's not to come at hostility with more hostility. Right? It's not to come at lies with more, or name calling with more name calling. No. Right? It's not helpful.
No. And ultimately, love will win the day. I believe it may not be tomorrow. It may be a long time from now. But ultimately, love will win the day because a person who's been canceled will be loved by a believer in Jesus who may be
Right.
very similar to them in the color of their skin or their gender or their sexuality, or might be very, very different. It's the Good Samaritan story where the surprising person that loved the guy that was beaten and left for dead and robbed
Right.
was a Samaritan. And I think Jesus was saying something very important,
Right.
that it's not about the color of your skin, or
Right.
that it's about something else.
Who is my neighbor, right?
Yeah.
Who is my neighbor? It's that person that bugs you the most.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
that person with whom you disagree with the most. That's what the Samaritan was,
Yeah.
right? For the Jew, it's like, oh, could you have picked anybody else
Yeah.
to be the Samaritan?
And a person who doesn't recognize that really doesn't grasp the gravity of our sin against God. And they say, well, that's what Jesus did for you.
Right.
Would you not do it for this guy? Hey, let me ask you. Let's a couple of things. Like so. One of the things that as I was listening to one of the podcasts you mentioned to me, with Jordan Peterson, which was really, I think we'll probably connect them to that one.
Yeah, we can.
With the caveat that he's not necessarily a follower of Jesus,
Right.
and he has a couple words that he likes to use, but we're not going to cancel him out for those
Right.
words. And so beware of that. But he was talking about education, and I didn't want to walk too immediately away from our response, but
Right.
we have to educate our kids. Can you speak a little bit about kids today that are going to school and what they're facing, and
Right.
what do we do in light of this?
I've got 2 high school boys, and I'll tell you what, the stuff that my kids are having to navigate in a public high school in Kansas.
Yeah.
Now, wherever you are in the world and you're listening to this, Kansas is, relatively tame place next to, like, say, New York or LA.
We
or
have Dorothy
Seattle.
and Toto.
We literally have the Wizard of Oz. And the things that my boys are having to face with the chaos about sexual identity, the chaos that has to do with drug usage and the normalization of teenage sex, and the conversations are coming up. You and I, when we were in high school, were completely unequipped
Yeah.
to navigate that in any way. And as a parent, as an old guy, I barely feel like I know how to help guide my sons through this ever moving landscape of confusion. And a lot of it is, it's the culture that has adopted a lot of different mores, and it's the cloudedness of categories and ethics and morals and individuality and group identity that is feeding into this, like, I don't know which way the wind is blowing today.
Yeah.
I don't know what this word means today. It meant something else yesterday. And so your kids are having to go, I don't know, I just kind of give up, right?
Yeah, they do.
And go
Yeah.
home and play video games.
Uh-huh.
So something that Jordan Peterson was saying in this podcast is he, and I don't know how I feel about this, but he was just saying, I would not send my kid to a public place of education.
Yeah.
Whether that's in elementary or high school or university.
Yeah, see, that's radical, because when I was raising my kids, I wanted them in high school to be in a public school,
Right.
because I wanted to test their faith under our watch, and it worked
Right.
out pretty well for us, back in that day.
Right.
But today it's a bit different. I don't know if I had to do it all over again. I'm not promoting Christian school or homeschooling or anything
Right.
like that, but it's something for us to begin thinking about.
Right.
And I'll tell you another thing that it leads me to is that a kind of a challenge for us, because you and I are pastors, but not everybody's a pastor in a church equipping people. What's we're trying to do? We're trying to equip you for your life and ministry. But I think at some point we fell asleep at the wheel because we thought everything was okay in America. And there's these call them the 6 or 7 pillars. So there's religion or church, but then there's media, there's the law, there's business, there's the arts, there's
Right.
entertainment, and education. And there was a time when Christians were coming up with a worldview, and they were leading in those spaces. And I think we fell asleep at the wheel a little bit,
Right.
and churches weren't doing as robust of a job of giving people a biblical understanding of a biblical worldview, and then really encouraging them into those spaces where they could lead. And we've essentially turned our educational system over. And I know there's lots of West Siders that are like fighting this,
Right.
like with all their power, and some of them are in places of power. But the overall system is not in favor of stopping this movement right now. It feels like an unstoppable movement. Would you agree?
Yeah, and it's come in largely through sort of like those mid-level bureaucratic administrative levels of organizations, even in government. There's a gentleman named Christopher Rufo who did he did a research assignment, actually set it to the presidential administration to say that this critical theory was being taught in the HR departments of federal government institutions, like where they're developing nuclear power and weapons, in the United States, and in the NSA and all these different organizations within the government this had got into by unelected administrators and bureaucrats, and they were teaching this in those levels. And it's the same thing in our educational system. These are people who came through while we were asleep at the wheel thinking this was some esoteric philosophy, and now it's been indoctrinated and being taught from the time kids are in kindergarten all the way up through college. And I would just say, as a parent, that's why we're doing this. I need to be aware of exactly what are we talking about? What does this language mean? And how do I identify it? How do I help my child understand that, as a Christ follower, we operate in a different way.
Yeah.
And, I honestly, I would be very cautious of where I send my kid to university.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd be very, very cautious
Yeah,
about that.
it snags the best of them. I tell you, it really it has, and it's going to make parenting that much more difficult. I mean, you're exhausted, with all the things related to COVID, but it's just you've got a difficult assignment ahead of you, and we're going to do the best we can to help you navigate it. And I have people in my network very close to me where the parents don't embrace this, and yet their kids in their 20s have fully embraced it, who follow Jesus. And it's kind of like a voodoo Christianity kind of thing. They embrace Jesus, but they also embrace the teachings of the witch doctor, if you will, and they embraced it, put it together for this new thing that doesn't look anything. And parents are like beside themselves on knowing what to and how to think about it.
Yeah, and our objective here is to speak full of grace and truth, because a lot of these folks, they really feel like they're doing the right thing because it sounds right. It sounds right on the surface, but it sounds right to say we want everyone to wind up equal. But here's the problem. It's the devil's in the details. Who decides that? Who decides what equal is? Who decides what the margin of error is? What do you do with people who aren't equal? And the problem is people are not bricks. God made us all to be individuals. We're not a bunch of uniform blank slates when we're born. We're gifted with intelligence, and we're gifted with looking a certain way, having certain innate abilities, and ultimately we have character that is unique to us. And it's not because of any other parts of our identity groups. And to say that everyone should have exactly the same outcome and we have to engineer it that way is problematic on so many levels. It kills competence, it kills motivation, it does a disservice to one group of people at the motivation of compassion, and then ultimately hurts the people that you think you're helping with your compassion because it tells them things about themselves that are not true.
Yeah.
And so, not to get too deep into that, but it is really a genuine problem when equality of opportunity is something we need to fight for.
Yeah.
But when you see people start talking about equality of outcome, you need to be very aware of what is actually occurring there.
Let's make a couple of concluding comments. We could go on a long time. And so I'll say a few things and then let you have the final word.
Okay.
I think that, first of all, that this movement is rooted in a failed movement of Marxism that was all about economics, and this one's about power, but it was a failed movement that at the very root of it, it oftentimes does not have God, a loving, all-powerful, truthful God, at the very center of it. We become gods in a way, and it's very, very legalistic and canceling, versus a grace-based deal, which Christianity is not. It is all about grace, and I think. Also, we are called to, in Colossians and Ephesians 4, to be super mindful of all of the schemes that come around and that toss us back and forth. And we need to really anchor ourselves in the truth of Scripture. Number 3, 5, 6, 7, I don't know which number I'm on. We need to love people the way Christ loved people, and even people who don't think the way we do. And we don't need, as followers of Jesus, regardless of what we look like, to be assuming something about another person based upon the color of their skin or of their gender or of their economic status. Jesus really called us to that, and we need to rise up and act differently. I think another one, we need to think about the future of our children and the spaces where we're putting them in. We get an hour a week if we're lucky, and the schools are getting 7 hours a day, 5 days a week, 9 months out of the year, and we just can't compete with that. So we're going to have to do a better job of asking ourselves, how do we really instruct our children? And at the end of the day, with all of this controversy, we know that that love is ultimately going to win. So even though we're uptight right now, we need to relax a little bit, because we know how the story ends. And even though there's a lot of controversy right now, there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of hatred, there's a lot of anger. At the end of the day, we know that Jesus wins, and this thing's all going to come together again. So be hopeful.
Yeah, and we need to see this through the lens of, one, there is real oppression. There is real racism. There is real justice that needs to be had for the poor. And in upcoming weeks, we're going to be talking about about racial reconciliation and justice for the poor, because as a Christ follower, Jesus clearly calls us to those spaces. But we do it because we see the image of Jesus in every individual. Not because I have some sort of socio-economic guilt attached to my skin color, but because I'm following Jesus into the places where he would go, and following him and entering into those needs, into those hurts, to be an advocate for justice and be an advocate for peace. But the tools that we have are different kinds of tools. I believe in what Dr. King said, that I dream of a day when my children, my boys, will be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. And in the meantime, as Christ followers, from Ephesians chapter 6, the scripture says, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. We put on the full armor of God so you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. Right? Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, authorities, and powers of this dark world, and against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, you and I put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground. And after you've done everything, to stand, because if you're laying down, it's a problem. Stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, with the breastplate of righteousness in place, and with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to this, take up the shield of faith, which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. What he says about you, what he says about that person that you don't like, is what defines them, and not even what you think about them. And our job is to turn into the wind and turn into the tension and to love them because Christ first loved us.
That's a great final word, my friend.
Thanks, everyone, for watching. And we just want to let you know, we got some more hard stuff that we're going to talk about in upcoming weeks.
But this lays the foundation.
This lays the foundation for a lot of it, yeah. And next week, we're going to try and get our arms around yet another topic of what Jesus has to say about the sanctity of life.
Wow.
Yeah, so we'll see you then. In the meantime, we would love to get your questions on future topics. If you would submit those on our show page, we would love to hear from you. We really would love to get your input, get your feedback, so that this will inform future podcasts. In the meantime, follow Jesus into every space in your life, honor him and love him, and we'll see you next time. We hope the conversation has challenged you and perhaps sparked some new ideas. If you'd like some additional notes and helpful links, visit the episode page at westsidefamily.church/podcast. And if you have questions, we'd love to hear them. Our last episode of the season, we'll devote an entire show to your questions, so you can also tell us what topics you'd like to hear and discussed in the future. Thank you for joining us today, and God bless you.